Post 322, Study Session 10, African Socialism. Introduction. In this lecture, I intend to examine the origin and nature of African socialism. Learning outcomes. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to provide a brief background to the rise of the body of thought now identified as African socialism, examine the elements of African socialism, and appreciate the context that gave birth to African socialism, as well as the major elements of these aspects of African political thoughts. The origin, meaning, and essence of African socialism. African socialism emerged as a concept in African political thought in the 1950s. This was at the time when many of the African states were preparing for independence. One major problem that the emerging local political elite in the various colonial territories faced was how to mobilize the values and energies of their people, traditional and modern, for the development of the territories after independence. It was in this context that African socialism emerged as a body of ideas. It is instructive, therefore, and this is a point you need to take special note of, that the leading originators and proponents of African socialism, Tom Mboya, Modibo Keita, and Sekou Touré, to Julius Nyerere, have tended to be heads of states of government in the newly independent states of Africa. If the origin of African socialism can be easily identified, its meaning is difficult to outline. It is often seen as a mythical glorification of the African past, as an importation into Africa of Marxist-Leninist thoughts, or as mere rhetoric, an attempt to impress, inspire, or intimidate. The fact that its proponents often not spoken with one voice, and that they have included African leaders of all shades from the more mythical Senghor to the very conservative Mobutu Sese Seko, and the more radical Kwame Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Touré, has further compounded the problem of definition. In fact, at one stage, especially in the period from the 1950s to the 1960s, African socialism was like a prospective beautiful bride courted by many African leaders, out to make a point about their intellectual and policy independence vis-a-vis the West, their welfarist inclinations, and their commitment to meaningful development in their newly independent countries. For these and other reasons, including the vagueness in perspectives on the concept, the meaning of African socialism is difficult to delineate. Nevertheless, one way in which we can jointly approach the issue is to address the two key words in the concept and what they mean, namely African and socialism. As was indicated in the course material on political ideas, Post 212, socialism generally refers to that political doctrine which promotes the public ownership and or control of the means of production and distribution, and pledges itself to the goal of bringing about an egalitarian society. Thus, African socialism implies a brand of this doctrine that is peculiar to the continent. African socialism has been known to portray socialism as being native to Africa, pointing to the age-long communism of African society in which the individual was adequately taken care of by the community. The proposal put forth by several of the proponents of African socialism was therefore for the strengthening of these communal ties and reinforcement of traditional practices in the face of modern pressures that were introducing divisive factors and forces into African societies. Let us now outline in more detail some of the issues, elements, and themes that have emerged in African socialism, and they include: 1. The nature of man. According to proponents of African socialism, man is, unlike the picture in the literature from the West, not inherently individualistic. Rather, man is basically a communal animal. He depends on and is part of the community not only for economic and social reasons, but also for spiritual succor. African socialism, thus, focuses on the needs of the individual as a member of the community, a community in which he is not in conflict either with himself or others. Thus, man is portrayed as being in a symbiotic relationship with the community. African socialism then proposes the application of this model in the modern world to encourage bonds of brotherhood, unity and conflict-free solidarity. 2. The nature and role of the family and kinship ties. African socialism sees the family and kinship ties as very important social frameworks in the ensuing community of relationships. Such networks are seen to work against the development of exploitatory relationships and are therefore conducive to the building of the communocracy envisaged by African socialism. 3. Perspectives on society. African socialism conceives of society as being largely free of class divisions which are prone to generate social conflicts. Rather, it portrays traditional African societies as being free of conflict due to their being classless and egalitarian. For proponents of African socialism, traditional societies of the past was one in which social wealth was used for the benefit of all, and there was no oppression and no division of society into opposite hostile camps. In the modern day, therefore, proponents of African socialism tend to frown on opposition in all of its forms, political, economic, or social, and to encourage the development of one-party regimes. 4. Perspectives on government and the states. As indicated earlier, African socialism was in a sense in the 1950s to 1960s an instrument for the mobilization of the resources of the new nations for political, economic, and social development. It is not surprising, therefore, that African socialism has tended to conceive of government and the state as a communocratic means of mobilizing national resources for development. Within that context, dissent is discouraged since it could have destructive consequences with regard to the overriding goal of unity of purpose in the search for development. Thus is born a perspective that encourages the development of one-party regimes. Thus, in the words of Otiti, African socialism regards indigenous government as a welfare organ in which everyone has vested interest. This conception of indigenous government has been carried into the notion of the new state government role. The government directs the state. Both state and government are creatures of the people, and because the ruled are also part of the single political party, they are in fact part of the government, the state, and of their machineries. Given these issues, elements, and themes of African socialism, it is not surprising that its proponents have been criticized both by socialists and non-socialists alike. For instance, they have been accused of trying to resuscitate practices and values that are better left dead, such as the tribal and kinship basis of community and governance. And 2, trying to paint an idyllic picture of a crisis-free past in order to discourage crisis, justify a crackdown on opposition, and thus encourage crisis-free political cultures in their own domains. One Marxist critique of African socialism is worth noting here. As Gregor puts it, for Marxists, whose theoretical machinery was economic interpretation and whose unit of analysis was class, the talk of mobilizing the energies of the people in the service of the nation under the direction of a political elite armed with myth could only represent a complete betrayal of socialism. While these criticisms have not seriously dampened the conviction of those who believe in African socialism, the recent developments in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, coupled with the tendency of autocratic African leaders to use the concept to service their authoritarian regimes, continue to put a question mark on the motives of African socialism and its goals. Study session summary. As a body of ideas, African socialism emerged in the 1950s in a context in which African countries were emerging from colonial status into independent sovereign entities. It has attempted to argue that socialism is indigenous to Africa and that its enduring characteristics, which could be used to foster development in contemporary Africa, is its emphasis on community, unity, and solidarity. It is not surprising, especially given the fact that its leading proponents have also been heads of government and states in the newly independent countries of Africa. that African socialism has been used to justify one-party regimes and the stamping out of oppositions. End of study session 10. Thank you for listening.